Hey everybody, my name is Jacob Moses. I'm the community builder at Strong Towns, and welcome to another round of Ask Me Anything. This is a weekly webinar series where we answer your most pressing questions about your place and the steps that it can take to become a more resilient and financially strong place. We have several fantastic questions today, inspired by a presentation we all heard on Tuesday with Joe Minicozy about the economics of development. Joined us again for round two. He shared a fantastic one a couple weeks ago as well. So just gonna spend some time digging into these questions and getting some fantastic insights from Joe and Chuck. Fellas, how are y'all doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Things are well here too. We're it's no longer snowing and should actually be in the 40s today and maybe 50s by the weekend. So we're going to be having an outside party. There'll be Minnesotans in shorts and social distancing, but there'll be a lot of white skin outside come Saturday.
Fantastic. Well, everyone joining us live, thank you. We want this to be an interactive experience and field your questions live. So as we knock out these questions, I hope you'll ponder your own questions. And if you hover over the Zoom window, click Q&A, share them there, and we will take some time to knock them out. Okay, let's knock out the first question that some folks shared on the Strong Towns community site. Joe, I have a question for you from Gail. Gail asks, Joe gives some examples of very small, low-rise buildings that are very financially productive. This seems to run counter to the models that demonstrate that the taller the building, the more financially productive it is. What are we to take away from this? Does this mean any small yet productive building would be even more productive if it were to be increased in size and height? Joe, what do you think?
Okay, that's a great question. And we get that question a lot. And it's part of what I was doing with the presentation was sort of playing with that a little bit. In other presentations that folks have seen, we do like in Florida. Can I take the screen over?
Go for it. Does it let you do it, or does Jacob have to allow you?
I think you can, Joe.
It says host disabled attendee from sharing this because you got to give me the ability.
No.
I think that's the default. So just give it a little deal. It's interesting because I feel like this is a numerator denominator question to a degree, right?
Yeah. Well, and some of it's density, it's age, it's design. It's also just the weirdness of what's going on inside the tax system. Okay, great. Thanks, Jake.
You should be good now.
Yeah, I got it. So there's certain biases baked into the tax system, and that was basically one of the things I was trying to explain in the presentation. Was there's a whole like rainbow of biases. There's social bias, cultural bias. There's confirmation bias. There's just biases inside the way that these tax policies are set up. So the biggest bias inside the tax policy is it waits for somebody else to act in the marketplace. So once somebody acts in the marketplace and they pay for something, it drives what the quote market value is. Well, that policy never questions all of the other policies that are baked behind it to steer that decision. And that's one of the things that we try to expose is why do we have parking lots are taxed less for that opportunity cost of infrastructure? Like this mouse that I have right here, when Apple sold me this mouse, they got the price of the plastic, the metal, everything out of it, they put into the price tag. Our real estate system doesn't work that way. And that's the fundamental flaw in connecting all of these economics, is that weird perversion that's just basically somebody did that in the 1700s and we're all still living with it today. Well, inside the private sector, they figured all that out. They figured out where all the loopholes are in the policy. So when I show Walmart and I say, don't hate the player, hate the game, they're smart people. They figured out that it's an incentive for them to do a junk building. So this is one of the examples that I show in a lot of presentations of small buildings. And this is an old study we did in West Palm Beach, Florida, to show a 3-story building next to a skyscraper that's 2 blocks away. I think it's like 22 stories tall. And you can see right out the door, the Darth Vader building is 9.2 million an acre, and the Anthony building is 10.5. So just a 3-story building is more productive than a 20-story building. Now, if to take Gail's question and say, well, Joe, if I were to stack that 3-story building on top of itself, would it be worth more money? Probably, but we generally don't work in that realm of it could be. We start with what's going actually on in your community, and let's just be agnostic about that and start asking questions. But yeah, probably if you did double that building, it would probably and most likely be more valuable. And it's really the function of its density more than anything else. This building is for those that know, floor area ratio is a measure, or FAR. This is effectively an FAR3 building. And this tower has, a buffer of landscape all around it that basically liquidates its value. So it's nice that somebody made a buffer policy, but why they would do that in the downtown is beyond me. And then also you're basically discounting that cost, because the assessor is going to go out there and go, well, this required berm of bushes right here has no market value. No one would pay for a berm of bushes, so therefore there's no value. Well, that actually depreciates the value of that building. So even though it's taller and has more mass, there are these other indicators that are there. So it's another Strong Towns message is beware of what you ask for. So if you want that buffer, why? So somebody let somebody with a bush love come into the city policy and put a bush barrier around these buildings. Well, you've also paid for that from a policy perspective because there's a discount value there. So I don't know if that properly gets
well,
question.
If I've got a follow-up, Joe, but just building on that, if you look at that build, the Darth Vader building, the Mustafar one on the right, if you got rid of that green space and had 3 of those buildings, it would be more productive than the Anthony building there on the left, right? I mean, that's essentially that's the design code is saying we're going to have this tower that is, doesn't really fit in and doesn't really work for this setting, but we're going to buffer it, to try to basically mitigate the fact that it's not really well planned for the site.
Yeah.
And, if you're willing to get rid of that buffer, you could have something way more productive.
Well, and it's also, it's indicative of the needs and desires of the time. Actually, I'm opening up the Minneapolis presentation for a second because there's some good stuff in Minneapolis as well.
I wanted to, while you're doing that, the thing that I wanted to ask you about as a follow-up, I think this question might also be alluding to, are some of those anomalies where we see the like the attorney's office in Peoria and the one little one-off building in but you know the ones I'm talking about. Where you've got these, and I think you use them to make the point that, in times when the value is in the land and it was about getting the most productivity out of that land investment, what you see is you saw people sometimes doing things that we look today as silly and ridiculous, like building a small little narrow building between 2 other buildings. And I've always looked at that when you present that, the thing that comes to my mind is like the Ojibwa Indian tribe using every part of the deer that they kill. It's not that like the little ligament in the leg has like tremendous value. You wouldn't try to have like millions of ligaments, but you've got this whole thing and you've got this extra part, and instead of just throwing it away and wasting it, you find a way to use it, and it actually becomes like really valuable because of that. And I feel like that's what you've shown is these people were poor, and because they were poor, they came up with innovative ways to make really good use of things.
Yeah, these people here with this fancy horse technology right there, and they found a way to make it work and maximize the value. This is downtown Minneapolis, right?
Yeah.
So this is a skyscraper. I mean, this is the big peak in the model at 240 million an acre, right? So let's look at this old stuff here. This is pulling 10 million.
Right.
And it's only 3 stories tall. This is 36 million, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories tall. So it's no, tower, but it's 30 million, right? So even outside of Minneapolis, these buildings here are pulling up to 6 million for a 2-story building. But one of my favorites are things like this, here's again, horse technology. This building is 18 million an acre. And think of that as a longevity too, that how many, like 100 years it's produced that wealth. Actually more than 100 years, we're talking 140.
Right.
Or, you know, this building at 51 million, but this is one of my favorites, the Shoreline building that's pulling 140 million an acre. Now remember that Wells Fargo is only 200 million. So
Right.
this is almost as productive. Now the reason why it's productive is this converted from office to condos. And once it moves to condos, I mean, just think about it from a construction standpoint. I've got bathrooms and kitchens in there, many more so than in an office building. And it's on a per square foot basis, like a kitchen and a bathroom is worth more than an office floor plate. You know, you just have more square footage of those kitchens and bathrooms. So that's why that price is so high.
Right.
But architecturally, this box has been able to convert into a magic different typology. And who would have thought in 1915 when this was built that it would be condos? You know, they weren't thinking that. They were just thinking of making the ground floor plane work, having retail down there and having something else above.
Yeah, it's a testament to the adaptability of that.
Does that answer that question?
Yeah, that was fantastic. Let's knock out another pre-submitted question. Got one from Sarah. Sarah asks, there are certainly threads of the topic of affordability in Joe's presentations. How can we use this information to enhance the message of housing affordability, availability, and diversity directly? Or is it strictly the logical leap from higher density equals better productivity financially and happens to create a regulatory framework that reduces the cost of housing? So Joe, we know from your presentations that, of course, this development pattern is far more financially productive. Where does it fit in the conversation of availability and affordability as well?
Well, as far as availability, you know, the first thing to ask is, you know, I showed the redlining. Actually, let's go to that real quick. The redlining in this last presentation.
The Kansas City one.
Yeah.
Which is just astounding data, the way that you've assembled that. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and so, you know, you've got all these parcels. This is probably the key indicator. You know, you've got vacant land. Well, that's available land. You know, I've got a street, a pipe, a sidewalk. I've got all of the commitment of municipal services to that land and no real value. And you look at the Kansas City, Kansas has got 3 square miles and Kansas City, Missouri's got 7 square miles. That's available land. Now, what's the incentive to that individual to redevelop that land? Nothing really. You know, it's just like, I can hang on to that. I'm being taxed really low. And that's one of the reasons why we showed, you can jump ahead to that, the economic value of that property is at $400 an acre, or $400 a lot of value. You know, I couched it on a standpoint of difference, that the value of that lot is $400 of value. The value of a building on that lot is 40 times more. Well, you can just go ahead and take what I say and just flip the script, right? Rather than say you're going to make 40 times more on having a house, well, it's also 40 times the penalty to the government to not have a house. So it's just like, how are we going to talk about this stuff? If you don't loop the stuff into the full conversation, you can't see where you're losing money all over the place to actually have that affordable housing. So this removes the opportunity for housing. There's no incentive for me to develop it. And therefore, as a government, I'm going to have to subsidize the housing one way or another, because the market's not going to come out and say, I'm going to lose money on housing. Like, why would a developer do that or a builder do that? So if it's going to cost me $180,000 to produce a house, that lot price is going to be part of it. And I think, actually, Chuck, I Twittered this a while ago that, you know, I go back to that Strong Towns talk on land value taxation as one of the best presentations on land value taxation. If we increase the cost of carrying that land, so you're at least paying the taxes to cover the cost of infrastructure, and, you know, maybe not go full Georgia's tax theory, but at least come up to a 2-drink minimum or something like this. You should at least get this kind of taxes out of it,
right?
Rather than tax that it's, there's nothing there. So I think that's one of the bleeding that happens. Now, if you start harvesting that money, so you want to hang on to that property and do nothing with it, you have a God-given right to that, to use your property that way. But you don't have a God-given right to we in government subsidizing your choice to do that. So what we're going to do is at least get our cost out, so that here's where the taxes stop from a value standpoint, and here's our impact fee that you're essentially taking from us. We're going to now, if you want to choose to do nothing, we're at least going to get that much more out of the taxes. Then we could use that to basically subsidize housing in another development, or give a developer that's building, 6 townhouses to subsidize the cost of 2 of them or something. You can think more creatively about how we talk about affordability, rather than just hope that somebody's going to show up and build it. It's how are you actively losing money in other places that you can use to stimulate growth in other areas. And I actually think this is also tied to COVID as well, that we're going to see changes economically, that we're going to have to be more fleet-footed and more adaptive to understand how to economically get involved in these decisions, rather than just hoping that things are going to change.
I also see, like in this neighborhood in Kansas City, tons of opportunity to build affordable housing. I mean, lots of vacant lots, lots of undervalued space, lots of places that are just begging for someone to come in and build modest things at modest prices that will actually create wealth for people in that neighborhood, allow them to get started at a low price point and build themselves up. I think one of the frustrations, though, is that where are those people? Where are the people set up to do that? I mean, you've got the Incremental Development Alliance, and I think they're doing genius work. You've got a guy like Derek Avery in Dallas, who's out working in a neighborhood that he loved and he grows up in and he lives in, doing this kind of thing. But we need to scale that. I mean, we need thousands of Derek Averys out there doing this kind of work. The problem is, when you're a city, you're a local government, and you're like, where are the people who are going to build at scale? Well, those are the people, and I don't want to get all torches and pitchforks right now, but those are the people who are getting bailed out right now. Those are the people who are doing these big commercial projects. Those are the people who are getting, the big centralized finance top-down loans. And when they come in, they're not doing a tiny house on a block in a poor neighborhood unless you subsidize them and pay them. Their model is to do 1,000 units at once, whether it's in a big tower or out on the edge of town. And I think that's the efficiency, resiliency trade-off that we see. And it's expressed in Joe's work, but I feel like, Joe, you're showing us what rational people should do. But I think there's also an added component of it, is that our market is not actually rational right now. It's not giving us rational outcomes. And I think that, if anything, this data should help us question why we're not getting rational outcomes.
Well, and also is that when we told them, or suggested, like, try 18 houses, and, the first reaction that we got was, well, the banking system's not going to finance that. So here's your way out.
Right.
That was just a way to just creatively get on the positive side of, here's how we solve that problem. Well, the next question is to ask is, how complicated is it to get through the process as a small builder? Mm-hmm. For a larger builder, you can carry that cost and spread it over multiple units. But I think that if you're in the role of government, you should be thinking of, is my process making it more onerous and more difficult? And why is that policy there? And I think in the first session, we talked about that Robert Frost quote, which is, don't tear down a fence until you know why it was put up. So we should be asking questions. Why are these barriers here? And are they necessary? If they're necessary, great. We don't want to have anybody building dangerous housing. There's building codes that cover a lot of that. But, for fun, if you work in planning, go over to the building department and try to read the building code. It's absolutely insane. Right. And I even, coming from the world of architecture, it used to frustrate the heck out of me trying to read this stuff. And yet my job was to try to help design those buildings. And it's just how we communicate policy. And sometimes we get onto I don't want to call it a high horse, but there's reasons why these policies are there and they're defensive. But sometimes we have to take a loofah and kind of scrub them off. Or could you pre-approve or pre-design? Could the government basically say, here are the houses we want. These are pre-approved. Anybody wants them, here's an architectural set, go for it. And then that way you're solving that problem of making it easier for somebody to just buy a preset. They used to do this in the 1920s. They actually had pattern books,
right,
of buildings. So why don't we do our own local pattern book? Like here's actually Asheville does a really good job with this. It's our city here with like handicap bathrooms, just really simple things. They actually make a little cut sheet, and they're like, no, just hand us this. This is the document. They basically make it easy for people, knowing we can eliminate that step for folks.
right.
And is it really going to cause a problem economically? Are architects going to clamor that they didn't get to draw that handicap bathroom? No, so it's just find ways to solve problems.
I was actually walking around in my neighborhood and noticing all of the 600, 700 square foot homes that exist. And I live in a very poor city, in a very poor place. And there's a lot of these houses that were built, pre-Great Depression, that some of them are still 600 square feet. Some of them are now 1,200 because they've gotten second stories or been added onto. The reality is, if you want to build a 600 square foot house today on a vacant lot, which we've got plenty of, we have categorized it a tiny home. So you have not only to go get your permit, but you got to go through all this other process. You've got to go beg permission from your neighbors, grovel in front of the planning commission. Then you got to go to a bank and find a bank that will give you a loan for such a small house. You've got to find a developer or a builder willing to build it. And they're all, spending their time building the high-end lake homes. So like all that little stuff is really expensive. And, if you want to build, you've got to have all the licensing requirements. And so you essentially have to tag along with one of the big builders in order to make that happen. To me, it's not shocking at all that even though the demand in the marketplace is clearly there, that we're not able to fill that demand. And it's all on the finance and the regulatory side.
Well, in the defense of builders too, it's like, people get frustrated with builders because they're just like, why are they building all these luxury units? Well, the real simple math of that is if I'm making 20% margins, that's probably not even that high. Let's call it 12% margins on whatever product I produce. I'm making 12% on it. If you were in business, would you want to make 12% on a $250,000 or 12% on $100,000?
Right.
It's like if you had the opportunity, like I'm going to spend 4 months doing something. What am I going to do? It's like anybody that's reasonable or rational would go and do that. It'd be a passion project to do the other. But there are people that try to do that. They see that as a niche and they want to do that. So how do we they're not making a lot of profit. They could go do something else. So how do we reward that system where your margins are thinner and make it easier to get that process happen? This is what we see with Walmarts all the time. It's really easy to go out at the edge of town. I go into a commercial zoning. No one's going to complain. I don't have to go through a design review process. There's no board of good taste about my Walmart. I just go and drop it out there. And from a planning perspective, we're just like, whatever, commercial, it's out there. It's nobody's problem. But we're going to beat you up on Main Street if you do a 2-story building. It's like we just have to, again, see our roles in these conversations and to see what the net effects of it is.
Joe, I have another great question that transitions well from this concept that you shared of, legalizing small. If we, identify vacant lots in existing neighborhoods, let's lower that barrier to entry, make it easier to build the modest home, whatever the vision is for that neighborhood. Got a question from Rick. He says, toward the end of Joe's presentation, he talks about taking small incremental steps. I understand the political reality of this statement, but what's the point of passing politically feasible legislation to allow, say, duplexes in single-family zones if the cost of land doesn't allow duplex to pencil out so nothing happens? Why spend significant amounts of public funds and the public's time and energy pursuing something that won't address the problem?
I don't quite understand that question. What's the problem in that question?
It might be perhaps if the cost of land is so low that's not feasible to invest and build.
I feel like
a single family to a duplex.
I feel like at the end of the day, I think it's important to understand what the ramification on land value is from our development pattern. And that is that it dramatically drives down the value of land. We talk about land as being this, location, and, You go to any city and they'll say, well, values are so high and housing's unaffordable. The reality is after World War II, what we did by building interstates and highways and making our entire development pattern based around our transportation system is we destroyed the underlying land value of urban places and neighborhoods. You took away that location value. And what we struggle with now today is that without rising underlying land values, when people move to a place, the place itself should become more valuable and the land should be going up. Without that rising land value, you will never get redevelopment naturally. You will not get a neighborhood where you can have single family homes become duplexes naturally, because why would anyone do that? It doesn't really, it's not really induced by the marketplace. There's no like natural mechanism to do it that makes sense from a development standpoint. And so the key to making this happen is always been, you've got to build a place. You actually have to build a place that people want to be. And so taking suburbs of single family homes and making them into duplexes, I think there will be some places where this works, but it'll be the places where you can create like underlying land value increases, not just like artificially impose a different development pattern. Go ahead, Joe.
So I showed that study of the rich person's house on top of the mountain, the person in the traditional African-American neighborhood here in Asheville, in my old house. This is my new house. It's actually a duplex. I live upstairs and I rent out downstairs. I mean, it's got a sweet porch. But this building that wasn't designed as a duplex evolved into a duplex over time. So it was built in 1913, I think. It's a Richard Sharp Smith house. And I live perfectly happily upstairs. I'm on the back porch of my house. It's an old sleeping porch, so it was converted to an office. But my land value is $2.4 million an acre of value. Compare that to the wealthy house on top of the mountain with the tennis court is only $500,000.
That's the total value, Joe. Drop down two.
Sorry.
When you're just talking about the land.
Yeah, 474 versus 80.
Right.
You know, in the house in the low wealth African American neighborhood, it's more than mine. But my property has gotten to such a level where it made sense at one point in time to split the building in half. It was a large house. It's like 2,400 square foot house. So it split into two 1,200 square foot apartments, basically. Minneapolis has done a great job with removing that barrier, that as the community grows, it could subdivide and replicate. That's the barrier of removing the zoning. I think I would advocate for looking at the cost side of this and understanding that the cost of that road in front of my house is not going to disappear. And we need to look at the relationship of that and see that this model of density and splitting in half actually doubles the taxes. So I pay a tremendous amount of taxes by growing up. You know, my property doubled in value. Because basically that's the way that the market looks at it, is that there's two units there instead of one, right? So that's kind of that evolution.
You have that one like crayon zoning drawing you show sometimes, and you make the argument about how the one person gets the discount because they own more land. Essentially, they're buying in bulk, and so we tax them less. And I always get that argument. Like, that argument makes sense because it's a distortion in the tax code. Yet on the other hand, that property you just showed, the house with the big lot and the tennis court and all that, their land, the underlying land, is actually worth less than the underlying land at your place.
Yeah.
The land at your place is worth more, and it's worth more because it is closer to things. It's got this proximity value to it. It's divided and developed in such a way that it creates that value. It's in a neighborhood that's creating value.
Well, it's also the perversion of these numbers up here.
Right. Right.
You know?
Right.
I'm less than a quarter acre by a lot.
Right.
And they're 3 acres. So there's that multiplier effect that the more you waste, the lower the value.
Right. So I look at this as an engineer. The way that I've always looked at this when you present this is that if I'm making an investment as a public corporation, as a municipal corporation, if we as a community are making this investment, what we're getting in land value out of Joe's house is a far superior return than what we're getting in land value in the Sunset Summit place. Look at all the road there. Look at all the infrastructure there. Look at everything that we built to make that possible. Now, understand that to get way up there, you also have pumps and, you know, all this like insane stuff to make this work. And you're like, well, that's a really expensive home, Chuck. It's $1.7 million. No, it is an enormous cost with a very low rate of return because of all the inputs that you've got. And so it's just like a, you know, if the product you're trying to get is a high returning land value, 62 Cortlandt Avenue gets you there. Sunset Summit does not.
Well, or another thing is if we just stop at just looking at the tax bill and you're like, wow, look, Joe, but they pay $20,000 in taxes. It's like, yeah, I'm only paying $5,000, but per acre, I'm paying $25,000. They're paying $6,000. So there's an opportunity cost for that discount, you know. But the smokescreen is they have a big tax bill. And it's like you need to make things apples to apples to see that. And once you start going down that road, you'll start seeing all the different weirdness baked into it. It's just, we just don't normalize things in apples to apples when we do economic analysis typically.
And the funny thing is, and I'll just add this maybe as a last thought, our ancestors did. I mean, that's the thing, is that people in the past who used to build cities, not manufacture them in bulk the way that we do today, but build them as a value proposition, something that was creating value for the community. The metrics that they had were all the metrics that Joe is sharing. I mean, it was all per acre. It was all value per acre. It was all how much wealth are we creating from the things that we're collectively investing in. It was not a, you know, quantity over quality type of argument. That's us. And I think the analogy here is the bank. The bank that makes the money, you know, we often think of like the banking model as being, I make a good loan and I make that at an interest rate. And so I'm able to, as a bank, borrow money at a lower interest rate, lend it out at a higher interest rate, and I make the margin. And so my value comes from having good investors and making good loans. And what we look at banks today is that that's not the business model of a local bank at all. A bank is all about transactions. How many loans can I produce? How many loans can I make out? How many things can I sell onto the secondary market? We made cities into, instead of having good investments, like a good portfolio, we've made their economics of cities being how many transactions can I do? And that's just, I mean, I feel like we're living through like the in vivid color now, what happens to an economy that's based on transactions as opposed to one that is based on creating a good, solid portfolio. You know, as soon as the transaction stops, it all goes to hell, right? Yeah. I mean, that's what we're seeing now today.
Oh, when the music stops, you can see the cracks in the pavement. You know, right. It's all of a sudden there's no revenues coming in. You can see what's happening. Can I just pop onto the questions that are online for a second? Just bust out a couple of them real fast.
You're taking Jacob's job away from him, Joe.
Sorry,
Jacob. If you see one to knock out, go for it.
Yeah, there's from one of the questions about hospitals and universities. I mean, we get this a lot with parks, you know, basically, you know, I'm not the character that I play in the webinar is a different character than Joe. You know, that person is there to make you think and ask questions, and so it's good to get this feedback. I'm not opposed to private or public parks and all of that.
Show Minneapolis, Joe.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Minneapolis for a second.
Because I feel like this is the most, when people ask me this too, they're like, so Chuck, you must be against parks then, because parks don't pay any revenue. You must be against public buildings. Like, why would we ever build a courthouse or a city hall? Go look at the city halls of the past that were not like cheap Walmart style buildings like we build today. They were gorgeous places. And you're like, well, why would people do that? Show us why, Joe.
Yeah, so the Asheville's a good example because I'm completely surrounded by federal forests. I went out mountain biking last night. It was super awesome. I enjoy living here to go out and do that. So I take part of those parks, and I'll pay more to live here to have that facility. So we did the land value analysis. We did the full analysis of Minneapolis, but what you're looking at is the dirt value per acre. So this is just dirt. There's no buildings. And here it is in 3D. And this is Minneapolis right here. And here's Wayzata. Wayzata is a
Wayzata. I'll give you the local pronunciation. It's Wayzata.
Wayzata. And basically, like the executives for 3M and all of the Fortune 5 Target, they all live out here and they take the highway in. It's the high-end suburban village that's out there. But we were just having a conversation with the staff at the city of Minneapolis, and I just put this out there, and I was like, it looks a little weird that the dirt in downtown Wayzata is the same value as downtown Minneapolis, just on an apples to apples standpoint. And I think it was Paul Magouche, is a planner there. He's like, oh my God, you just proved the county ordinance 1983-22. He started going down all these numbers. I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, up until 1983, the county had a policy. It was Minnesotan. Everybody should have access to the lakes. We're a lakes place. We're all in this together. A very Minnesotan attitude. And they changed that policy to privatize the edge of the lakes, that people could then build their mansions along the edge of the lakes. And we all understand the concept of lakefront or oceanfront property, right? The property for the ocean and the lake doesn't disappear. It just slides up to the real estate next to it. So you see the value of the lake slides up to the crust along the edge of the lake. That seems fair. It seems reasonable. Well, what happens to the value immediately adjacent to that? Those people don't have a lake view, so therefore they have no value, right? So you've taken that opportunity of value and pushed it into the edge. Well, before that policy changed, these two lakes are publicly accessible. They also have a greenway around them. There's a park and a cemetery. There's a lot of public amenity around that. And because there's more people in the public that have access to it, that value is then transferred into this neighborhood. You see the dirt value in this neighborhood. That value is spread like butter into the neighborhood, as opposed to just sticking all your butter on the edge of your crust, So I think that as we talk about this stuff, a university has costs. Boston's a great example of this. Boston has 250 colleges and universities, an immense amount of non-taxable real estate, which means that the city has all the costs of these college kids getting, hammered and causing trouble when they're drunk running down the streets. So you have to pick up the police cost. The city of Boston actually worked out this thing called a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes, where they go to the universities and say, hey, look, there's costs that you all produce in our community and we have to pick them up. And I'm going to say this as an alumnus of the school. In their infinite arrogance, Harvard was like, but we're Harvard, we were here before you, and you can't do this to us. And they eventually guilted Harvard into paying some taxes, which, they do that cooperatively. They work that out because, yes, Harvard is a valuable school, but they also understand the reality of running a government. It's not called the Harvard Corporation for nothing. It's a business. They get it. So I think that's the thing is that as we talk about this stuff, universities, hospitals, they're all non-taxable, except for Colorado. Hospitals are taxable. That's kind of interesting. It's different in every state, but these are needs in our community, and we're all experiencing that right now. Is I want to make sure that I have a good hospital here in town, especially with COVID going on. So these are costs of community, and we have to understand that we're all in this together as a corporation. So those amenities are necessary, and there's a public good in them. How do we make sure that we're getting that value back in the community?
Well, I feel like too, in this drawing here on the left with the privatized shoreline, in Minnesota, we still have a requirement that all lakes are public. And so this is Lake Minnetonka on the left. There are public accesses on the lake. And if you live anywhere in the state of Minnesota, you can go to that public access and put your boat in and go out on the lake. But the actual shoreline is privatized. So there's no public access to the shoreline. And on the right, with the chain of lakes in Minneapolis, you've got the public access to not just the lake itself, but to the actual shoreline. And what that does is it creates this, it radiates the wealth of that green space back for blocks and blocks and blocks into the neighborhood. Now, all those neighborhoods have their wealth increased because of that public amenity. You've got a public amenity in both places. It's just designed differently. And so when I look at like my courthouse here in town, I live on 4th Street in Brainerd. When I go out my front door and I looked to the south, at the end of my street is the county courthouse. built in 1930 something. And it's got, you know, very poor town, and it was poorer back then, the middle of the Depression. They built this thing with like Roman columns and like great classical symmetry, and it's at the very end of the street. It's kind of framed by the street itself. They did that so that the wealth of that investment, the value of that investment, it wasn't just utilitarian. It wasn't just functional. It was actually designed to make everybody around it wealthier, because now we've got this great like landmark in the middle of town. The new county building is kitty corner to the old one. It sits on a lot. My daughter, when she was young, thought it was a Target building because it's hideously ugly. And they got the dumpsters and the, you know, the loading docks and all that, like right out adjacent to where everyone's trying to walk to the downtown. And subsequently, it doesn't radiate any value. So I'm with you, Joe. I feel like we're in agreement that like we need hospitals, we need public buildings, we need parks. A lot of this is about how you build them, design them, lay them out, and have them interact with the community around them so that they become value creation machines instead of just transactional costs of doing business.
So back to the questions on Mark asked about 17th century tax forms and that New York City is more modern. New York State is laughably bizarre. I'm going to say that it's like it's some freewheeling negotiation that happens, and realize they're operating in a state where you have this hyper sophisticated Manhattan, and then you have places like Rome, New York, where I grew up, and somehow that state has to wrestle with those two different dualities. And upstate New York is really, really economically depressed, and they essentially negotiate with you because they understand that they've got to pay for the community, but they also understand how broke everybody is up there with a lack of jobs. So they've developed this sort of, it's kind of arbitrary. We've been actually, because we do so many different places, we're starting to come up with this quadrant of those places that are sophisticated, but simple. You get it? It's like very transparent. And those places that are complicated and sophisticated. So New York is a complicated and sophisticated place. Canada is a complicated and simple place. I jokingly showed that soundboard from our nightclub versus the 1970s Equalizer. North Carolina is unbelievably easy as far as its property tax standpoint goes. It's really simple to get through, and it's very transparent. North Carolina is ironically turning out to be one of the better states from a property tax standpoint. But all of them have a genome that go back to England. And it's, for me, what's been kind of fascinating of all of this, having done work in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and then here in our country operates like 50 different countries, operating with their own little individual systems. So they've taken the genome of the British property tax system and just basically exploded it. The Minnesotans are behaving more like the Canadians, where they're taking all these data inputs, they make it really easy to follow the system, and then they basically leave it up to the citizen to kind of, here's the information, go for it. New York's more like you gotta talk to somebody and kind of like know somebody and some things that are going on. It's very New York about it. But there's got to be a way to kind of detach from that for a second and say, what are we really trying to do here? So our ethos is the whole, let's just start with like pay as you go. Like, what's the cost of this thing, and how do we figure out how you use it and what it's paying its taxes back? That's kind of our attitude of showing this in the community. And I would advocate that we should be coming to a 21st century way of thinking of it. At the extreme level, you get the smart cities people, where they talk about, all these sensors and things. Intellectually, that's a really good idea. Intellectually, I agree with it. But when we go to city after city after city, and a lot of them don't even know how many pipes they have, they don't know where their telephone poles are. If we're coming from that level of ignorance, and I don't mean it in a bad way, it's just the inertia of how governments operate, to going to smart sensors. It doesn't matter how many smart sensors and data we get. If we're not looking at existing data, this isn't going to help us. And I think that's kind of, I don't know if that answers the question, but the other question from Raleigh is about the You know, if you have bigger buildings, you're going to need longer hoses, higher ladders, et cetera. When we first started doing this, and we, you know, Chuck, we did this, we talked this through in Lafayette. Chuck and I had this, it was actually a brilliant process. I liken it to a scene from, oh God, what was the name of that movie? But Chuck and I sat in this windowless fluorescent room for like a week, and every department director came in and we interviewed them. And it was an amazing process. But we talked to the fire department, the police department, all these people, and we started to realize some of this stuff is not, it's expensive, but it's not important for the study. What's important is understanding the long-term effect of all of this stuff. So buying a ladder truck, yeah, a ladder truck is super expensive. You're going to be spending more than $1 million on a piece of equipment. If you just look at that as a line item, you're like, yeah, that's really expensive. But if you see that you owe $50 million a year in the maintenance of your streets, 50 million is a lot more than that truck. Mm-hmm. Now, we could debate the fact that whether or not you need a chrome-plated diamond angled bumper on your damn truck. I mean, you don't need that, but fire people want it. My brother's a firefighter. It's very exciting to see a big, huge $10,000 chrome bumper. Do you need that on a truck? That's debatable. But again, don't sweat the small stuff. See the bigger issue, and the ticking time bomb is that infrastructure.
Yeah, I feel like it's the that discussion gets a lot to like the throwing the office party and ordering, you know, the fancy pizza instead of just the chips and sandwiches. You're like, oh, we splurged, and you're like, yeah, but you know, it's costing us $20,000 to have you all sitting here. So the $200 we spent on pizza is not it might be a big meal, but it's not that big, you know?
Joe, can I hit you with another pre-submitted question?
Sure.
Got one from Steven. Steven asks, when I look at Urban 3's profit and loss maps for cities, sometimes I see suburban style developments that are profitable and traditional pre-World War II neighborhoods that lose money, especially in residential areas. It looks like the financial picture is more complicated than all post-World War II suburban development is insolvent and all pre-World War II development is solvent. Can Joe explain why the picture might be more complicated?
It is complicated.
It is complicated.
Let's see. Let's just go to the example that I showed. Eugene is a good one, and I showed it in the last show. You know, this is Lafayette. This is a super complicated model, but really in Lafayette's case, the biggest issue is stormwater drainage. That they basically, their great grandparents didn't go out and build in the swamp, but you know, modern attitude is, you know, we could drain that. We can build a concrete river that funnels the water out. Well, that's fine. You get all of this access to new land and new development, but what's the cost of that concrete river now? So when you program it into the model, this is what it looks like. So for Lafayette, it's the concrete river issue. In Eugene, it's different. So let's go to Eugene for a second. Eugene has some wetland issues where this whole neighborhood right here, this little wedge, like Manhattan Island kind of floating in here. That piece has a lot of, it's basically a wetland. So it's got a lot of pumps and a lot of things in there that just don't make it work. There's areas that do work because they're, you know, essentially higher valued commercial product. In lots of states, we see this all the time where we'll tax commercial property higher at a higher rate, you know, and for office buildings, there's just like, whatever, we'll just pay it and that'll be a cost of business. In the case of a Walmart, that drives them even more to want to make a cheaper building because you're taxing me higher. So it's just being aware of that. And, you know, and I think I showed in one example of Kansas on 2 weeks ago. In Kansas, actually, let me just get to that. I have to speak with pictures.
When I started this, Joe, like when you and I first met each other and found each other, I was actually searching for a development that was profitable because I was running the numbers on them and I couldn't find them. And to me, when I started to recognize places that were productive, it was very clear that it was easier to be productive and it was easier to remain productive if you were built in that pre-depression walkable format. That doesn't mean that all of it is productive. It just meant that it was easier to accomplish it. It was harder to accomplish it the further you were from that framework. The more auto-oriented you are, the more spread out you are, the more you were dependent on a lot of things upstream from you, the more difficult it became to make those places cash flow and work. But it's not like it could never. I always say, like, my parents' farm was cash flow positive for the community back when it had 2 tire paths through the woods and no infrastructure. Now that they built a school and ran $2 million worth of pipe in front of their place, it doesn't work at all.
I just have to say, it was a lot of fun getting a tour of Brainerd from Chuck and driving down that road. And we counted all the fire hydrants in the middle of this forest. He's like, there's another one. There's another one. There's another one. And it was just like, you're seeing all this forest out there, and like, there's nice red fire hydrants. But this is the tax system in Missouri. And you can see that, this is what you're taxing 19% of that house. You're taxing 32% of that building. So on $500,000 worth of value, you're paying, if this is 500,000 and that's 500,000, you're paying almost double the taxes here. So let's say 59% of the taxes. In Kansas, it's even worse. You're only paying 46% of the taxes of the commercial product. So they're very literate about tax increment finance. And we showed them this, and we're like, look, that's TIF. I mean, you have tax increment finance where you go, a developer argues for getting a tax break. Okay, that's tax increment. But by taxing yourself less, that's also TIF as well. In a lot of states, they do this. There's a different level of valuation for commercial versus residential. So therefore, there's a tax break there. And so we just went ahead.
It's not like it costs less to plow the snow in front of your house than it does in front of your strip mall either. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is like, it's not like the cost of service has changed dramatically from one to the other.
Well, we showed the one in Florida, and there's some planners in Florida that reacted to me. They're like, well, Joe, but we need to keep people in their houses. We need to tax them less. And I'm like, you still have to run a government. It's like, yeah, it's great that you want to give everybody a tax break, but there's still a cost to all that. And which is fine. Just make sure you're running the numbers and you can afford that subsidy, or that's the best place for the subsidy. But this is just making a map of who's paying 19% and who's paying 32%. So you see how much more the totality, so many more people have the bigger tax break. And again, we're not judging. We just want you to see it and be aware that this is a flaw inside your mathematical system. So you at least can see what's going on. But that's a lot of the city that gets the subsidy. So just be aware of that stuff.
Y'all, we have about 5 minutes left. Joe, I know you've been peeping the questions. As you're scrolling through that, do you see anything in particular that you want to hit before we wrap up? Or do you trust me to pick one for you?
Go ahead and pick one.
Okay. Let's do a pre-submitted question. Got one from Kendall Hillis. Kendall asks, I am 30 years old and am reluctantly considering a move to a suburb. This suburb recently hired a consultant to conduct workshops with residents to understand the needs and vision of the community. The results of outreach indicated that many people are interested in components of a strong town. What is the future of suburbs, and will these desires be enough to convince city councils to change development patterns?
One of the things that we realized with, we're seeing this in the town of Cary, and I showed their example, that, they started as a suburb, and now they're facing a problem. So here they are sitting outside of Raleigh, and they never built up their downtown. So they have to critically think about that. They have to, for the questioner, I'd ask her, do they have the sophistication or interest to start asking the deeper questions? In Cary's case, there's one, Johns Creek we did, is a better example.
I see that. I added Josh. Josh was commenting in the chat section, so I added him to our presentation, and I saw that he just unmuted himself. So maybe Josh has something there.
Hi.
I wanted the world to see the some of the brains behind some of these models, so I added you, Josh.
First time caller.
see, there's hope. If you are active enough in the chat board, you can get enlightened to the higher. You could transcend to become a panelist, apparently.
We'll make you host next.
Josh has street cred.
He does.
I've done some stroding in my time.
So
Yeah, you have.
So
So
Johns Creek, Georgia, is outside of Atlanta, and it's near Gwinnett County. And everybody, I think everybody's seen the Gwinnett County experience when I do the whole we don't have sprawl, or we're not dense. Let me just show the Johns. This is actually one of Josh's models. So Josh was doing Johns Creek or Gwinnett County, and he showed me this map, and I'm like, what the heck is going on here? And I'm like, Josh, could you turn it on its side? So this is Josh turning the model, and you can see it's like a 1970s shag carpet. At the same time Josh was doing this, he was also doing Orange County, North Carolina, and this is what we typically see in a model, and you can see the different places. And Hillsborough is a suburb of Chapel Hill. It's its own town, though. You can see it's downtown in Hillsborough. So even though it's suburban, it's got a downtown. Carborough's got a downtown. Chapel Hill does, and this is new urbanism. But this is Gwinnett County. It's like this straight across the whole thing. So I was showing that in Johns Creek, and they're all laughing at how stupid those people could be. In Johns Creek, this is Fulton County. This is another one of Josh's models, but here's Johns Creek, this little red area right there. So that's Johns Creek. And for the viewers in the audience, you can pretty much tell what I'm about to do is like, here's Gwinnett County. And I asked them, I said, how are you any different from Gwinnett County? You look the same to me. And the evidence is right there. Now, the crazy thing is, here's their downtown. Here's our downtown in Asheville. You can see our city versus their city, right? We're basically the same population as them, right? Here's the square miles. We're a little bit bigger, but their density is way more dense than ours. And here's the peak of value per acre. The peak is theirs is 6 million. Ours is 47 million. And when you look at the total value, our city's worth 13 billion. Their city's only worth 10. So we're $3 billion more value on this pretty much the same population. So the physical form of how it developed, however, are two totally different animals. So we've got this golden goose called downtown that's just hemorrhaging value out there. Well, we can use that value to help support our suburban neighborhoods. And that's basically how Asheville's operated, is that we didn't build this 1920s downtown. Some lost civilization of androids left it for us, or humanoids or whatever, but we're able to keep on growing off that wealth, but we have to keep on feeding that golden goose to get more eggs. The suburban environment is going to have to learn that. And so Johns Creek has to get past the fact they've built out all their whole entire community. Now what? You've got all of this development. Is any of it distinguished or differentiated from a valuation standpoint? And I think that's going to be the challenge for the suburban environment. You're already starting to hear people talk about interventions of growing up a little bit, building that main street, doing the things that they didn't do because of habit of the last 50 years of development pattern, where the old way of building would start there and grow out. So it's just, it's about learning what we forgot. And Josh, did I cover that properly? Is Josh still there?
Yeah.
He is.
Yeah.
This has always been the place where I don't think you and I disagree, Joe, and I don't think you and I disagree on this, Josh, but where our framing has always been different. And I think it comes a little bit from our background and the story that we're trying to tell, because your framing has been, like you just said, if you want to have all these suburbs, you need to have a great downtown, because your downtown is subsidizing your suburbs. Like that's how this whole thing works. And my framing has always been, your city's broke. Stop building that crap that like you can't afford, and build more of the stuff that's actually making you money. And it's interesting because I think in the economy prior to COVID-19, your argument actually was a more pragmatic and prudent argument, because it actually met people where they were and was, I think, in reality, probably more palatable. I think in a post-COVID world, depending on how things shake out economically, but if we are ultimately revealed to be as fragile as we seem to be right now, our framing might be a little bit more salient to people, because you might not have the choice to subsidize all that unproductive stuff out there.
I have the answer to this, Chuck.
Yeah, go for
You have kids. I don't.
it.
And people with children understand this behavioral quirk right here, which is counter control. That when you exert a change to someone's behavior, they're going to push back. When you say no more suburbia, the first thing that's going to happen is counter control. And anybody that's got a child understands counter control. The first time you exert pressure on that child, what do you get? You get the 50-pound bag of sand on the floor that you have to pick up, and your kid's like, it's like, so you understand you have to be more stern to stop that action. Ultimately, I do agree with you. I think that it will take that Strong Towns message of being the adult in the room and saying, we know you want the ice cream, you can't have it till you get home. It's like it's behavior.
Yeah, it is behavior. Thanks, Joe.
Well, thank you all.
Joe, Chuck, our beloved last second panelist, Josh, thank you all. That was so much fun. That's the top of the hour. We'll wrap up this week's Ask Me Anything. Thank you, everyone who joined us live. This was a lot of fun. I know we got just about a dozen unanswered questions.
I feel like we should do this every day for like the next 2 months.
I think so, or at least knock out maybe another 30 minutes.
I was thinking a 12-hour straight filibuster.
Well, how about this? What if we got the questions? Would it be fair to? I mean, I think Josh and I would love to answer them on a point-by-point basis, or see how we can try either have another session like this.
Totally.
And we record it, or if you want us to do some document you could post on Strong Towns, just let us know.
Fantastic.
There's a lot of awesome questions. I want to thank everybody in the audience for participating, hanging in the space, but also for participating in the questions.
Yeah. Joe, how about this? We have a dedicated platform on the community site where we've been collecting all of these questions in response to your presentation. How about we collect them all there, then I'll get you that link. And then as you and Josh have some downtime, maybe
Awesome.
Knock out some responses there. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Awesome. Well,
Beautiful.
folk, if we did not answer your question live, if you check out the Strong Towns community site, that's community.strongtowns.org, ask your question there. I'll make sure we get that moved to the aforementioned platform where Joe, Josh, and his peers can get these questions answered. Again, they're fantastic. We appreciate y'all, asking the tough questions about your place, and we'll make sure we get all of these addressed.
Here's my question. Does Josh have a Shaco? That's what I want to know.
Oh man, was Josh a band guy?
I don't think Josh has a Shaco.
Oh, I've got a special hat for when I'm on camera next time. Stay tuned for next week to find out what my secret mask is.
Chuck, do we have one of these next week? Do we have a presentation?
I think next week is just boring old me. I'm doing neighborhoods first on Tuesday.
Gotcha.
We talk about making good neighborhood investments, and then next Thursday we'll have a Q&A follow-up on that one.
Beautiful. And everyone, you can find the link for those at strongtowns.org/events, and look forward to chatting then. And again, please share your questions at community.strongtowns.org, and we'll make sure we get them answered. Everyone, thank you. Thank you for the pre-submitted questions, joining us live, for all the wisdom per usual. And we'll do this again soon. This was fun.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you.
Everyone.
Take care.
Bye.